The Paris Commune, the first anarchist revolution. While technically it is false, well, there are many cases of anarchist societies and revolution predated Paris Commune. In fact, while 99% of the human species that existed is prehistory, basically almost everywhere in the world, from the Americas to Australasia to Africa to Europe to Asia, at least around 50 well-known tribes and indigenous people live under anarcho-communist societies for as long as 70,000 years, and some as recent as 10,000 years. But when we think of anarchist revolution, we think from the times of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, and other important intellectuals like Louis Blanc, for example, or Louis Blanqui. While many Marxists trying to use the Paris Commune as their own revolutionary success of the dictatorship of the proletariat, despite being false by all accounts, even by Marx's own admission that the Civil War in France becoming the most revisionist writing that he ever did, admittedly being an anarcho-syndicalism is successful in practice, unlike his approach of a centralized hierarchical authority. Many of the ideas of the Paris Commune came from the predictions and the major ideas and works of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, especially in What is Property, the System of Economic Contradiction, which was the original capital which Karl Marx basically plagiarized. Watch my previous video of Proudhon versus Marx to understand how Marx took many of the anarchist ideas and claimed it to be his own original. Also, his other works like The Principle of Federation and The Political Capacity of the Working Class, and his most detailed discussion of mutualism is the general idea of the revolution. These ideas and his predictions heavily become true in the Paris Commune of 1871. While many people were heavily influenced, of this event, we see many influential figures of the Paris Commune like Louis Michel, who was a military activist during the Paris Commune and in building the anarchist movement in France. After it did not preclude her writing articles on the libertarian press, she became a keen anarchist thinker and socialism as a whole. Many of these revolutions or revolutionary movements are relatively unknown to anybody who is not anarchist or let alone a socialist. But many people heard of the Russian Revolution, but few will know the popular movements of the lifeblood before the Bolsheviks seized to power, the role the anarchists played in the revolution, which I did in my previous video, the long critique of Marxism. The Bolsheviks did basically nothing. They're trying to keep up with everybody else because basically an anarchist bottom up spontaneous revolution. Even the Bolsheviks themselves had to use anarchist tactics in order to be ahead of the game. And few even heard of the Paris Commune or the Italian factories, or the Spanish collectives, or the Argentinian revolts of spontaneity in the early 2000s. The Paris Commune of 1871 played an important role in the development of both anarchist ideas and movement, as Bakunin commented at the time. Revolutionary socialism, i.e. anarchism, has just attempted its first striking and practical demonstration in the Paris Commune. It showed to all enslaved peoples, and there are many masses that are not slaves, the only road to emancipation and health. Paris inflicted a mortal blow upon the political tradition of bourgeois radicalism and gave a real basis to revolutionary socialism. The Paris Commune was created after France was defeated by Prussia in the Franco-Prussian War. The French government tried to send in troops to regain the Prussian National Guard's cannon to prevent it from falling into the hands of the population. Learning that the Versailles soldiers were trying to seize the cannon, recounted participant Louis Michel, men and women of Montmartre swarmed up in the booth in the surprising maneuver. These people who were climbing up to the battle believed they would die, but they were prepared to pay the price. The soldiers refused to fire, and cheery crowd and turned their weapons on their officers. The fire-cheer crowd turned their weapons on their officers. This March 18, the Commune had begun, and the people wakened. The 18th of March would have belonged to the allies of kings, or to the foreigners, or to the people. It was the people. In the free elections called by the Parisian National Guard, the citizens of Paris elected a council made up of a majority of Jacobins and Republicans and a minority of socialists, mostly Blanquistes and authoritarian socialists and early Marxists and followers of the anarchist Proudhon. Despite the anarchist Proudhonians at the time were basically the majority in most cases, until much later the Blanquists and the Marxists took over, tried to put centralized authority, and basically fell off his ass. This council proclaimed Paris autonomous and decided to recreate France as a confederation of communes, or i.e. communities. Within the commune, the elected council people were recallable and paid an average wage. In addition, they had to report back to the people who elected them and were subject to recall the electors if they do not carry their mandates. Why this development caught the imagination of anarchists is clear. It is strong similarities with anarchist idea. In fact, the example of the Paris Commune was in many ways similar to how Commune had predicted that a revolution should occur, a major city declare itself autonomous, organize itself, leading by example, and argue the rest of the planet to follow it. For example, see the letters to Albert Richter in Bakunin on anarchism. The Paris Commune became the process of creating a new society, one organized from the bottom up, and it was a blow for the decentralization of the political power. That's a quote by Voltaire de Cleyre. Many anarchists play a role within the commune. For example, Louis Michel and Reclus brothers and Eugene Verlaine, the latter murdered in the oppression aftermath, as for the reform initiated by the commune, such as the reopening of the workplace as cooperatives. Anarchists can see their ideas as associate labor beginning to be realized. By May, 43 workplaces were cooperatively run, and Louvre Museum was a monetarist factory run by Workers' Council. Echoing Proudhon and many of the mechanics union and the Association of Metal Workers argued that, and I quote, our economic emancipation can only be obtained through the formation of workers' association, which alone can transform our position from that of wage earners to that of associates. They instructed delegates to the Communist Commission on Labor Organization to support the following objectives: the abolition of the exploitation of man by man, the last vestige of slavery, the organization of labor, mutual association, and unalienable capital. End quote. In this way, they hope to ensure that equality must not be an empty word in the commune. The engineers union voted at the meeting on the 23rd of April that since the aim of the commune should be economic emancipation, it should be organized labor through association in which there will be a joint responsibility in order to suppress the exploitation of man by man. As well as self-managed workers' association, the communards practice direct democracy in a network popular clause, popular organizations similar to the directly democratic neighborhood assemblies or sections of the French Revolution. And quote by Martin Philip Johnson in The Paradise of Association, people govern yourselves through your public meetings, through your press, proclaim the newspapers of one club. The commune was seen as an expression of the assembled people, for the quote to another club. Communal power resides in each ardennescent neighborhood, where men are reassembled who had the horror of the yoke and servitude. Little wonder that Gustave Gilbert, artist friend and follower of Proudhon, proclaimed Paris as a true paradise. All social groups have established themselves as a federation and a master of their own fate. End quote. In addition to the Commune's declaration to the French people, which echo many of the key anarchist ideas, it saw the political unity of society as being based on the voluntary association of all local initiates, the free and spontaneous course of all individual energies for the common aim, the well-being and the liberty and the security of all. The new society envisioned by the Communards was one based on the absolute autonomy of the Commune, assured to each its integral right to each Frenchman to full exercise of his aptitude as a man, as a citizen, and as a laborer. The autonomy of the Commune will have for its limits only the equal autonomy of all other communes at the adhering to the contract. The association must assure the liberty of France. With his vision of confederation of communes, Bakunin was correct to assert that Paris Commune was a bold and clearly formulated negation of the state. Moreover, the Commune's ideas of federation obviously reflect the influence of Proudhon on French radical ideas. Indeed, the Commune's vision of communal France, based on federation of delegates bound by imperative mandates issued by their electors of subject to recall at any moment, echoes Proudhon's ideas, and Proudhon had argued in favor of the implementation of binding mandate in 1848 and for federation of communes in his work The Principle of Federation. Thus, both economically and politically, the Paris Commune was heavily influenced by anarchist ideas. Economically, the theory of associated production exposed by Proudhon and Bakunin became cohesively revolutionary practice. Politically, the communes called for federalism and autonomy. Anarchists see there, and according to Bakunin, future and social organization being carried out from the bottom up by the Free Association Federation of Workers and starting with associations, then going to communes, the regions, the nations, and finally culminating in a great international and universal federation. End quote. However, for anarchists, the commune did not go far enough. It did not abolish the state within the commune, which many of the Marxists and Blanquists and other socialists who subscribe to hierarchies has trying to convince everybody that we need to keep it. And has it abolished it beyond it. The communards organized themselves in a Jacobin manner, to use Bakunin's cunning term. As Peter Kropotkin pointed out, while, and I quote from Words of a Rebel, while proclaiming the free commune, the people of Paris, an essential anarchist principle, they stopped mid-course and gave themselves a communal council copied by the old municipal council. Thus, the Paris commune did not break with the tradition of the state of representatives, government, and did not attempt to achieve within the commune that organization from the simple to the complex, if inaugurated by proclaiming the independence and free federation of the communes. This led to disaster as the Commune Council became immobilized by red tape and lost the sensitivity that comes from the continued contact with the masses. Paralyzed by their distancing from the revolution center, the people, they themselves paralyzed the popular initiative. End quote. In addition, an attempt at economic reform did not go far enough, making no attempt to turn all workplace into cooperatives, i.e. the expropriate capital, and forming associations of these cooperatives to coordinate and support each other's economic activities. Paris stressed Voltaire declared, and I quote from her, failed to strike at economic tyranny and something will go to achieve, which was a free community whose economic affairs should be arranged by the groups of actual producers and distributors, and eliminate the useless and harmful element now in possession of the world's capital. End quote. As the city was under constant siege by the French army, it is understandable that the communards have other things in their minds. However, for Kropotkin, such position was a disaster, and I quote from the man himself, they treated the economic question as a secondary one, which would be attended to later on after the triumph of the commune. But the crushing defeat which soon followed and the bloody thirsty revenge taken by the middle class proved once more that the triumph of a popular commune was materially impossible without a parallel triumph of the people in the economic field. End quote. Anarchists drew the obvious conclusion, arguing that if no central government was needed to rule the independent communes, if the national government is thrown overboard and national unity is obtained by free federation, then a central municipal government because equally useless and nauseous, the same federation principle would do within the commune. Instead of abolishing the state within the commune by organizing federation of the rarely democratic mass assembly like the partisan sections of the revolution of 1789 to 1793. For example, for more details, see the Peter Kropotkin's work The Great French Revolution. The Paris Commune can represent government and suffer for it. Instead of acting for themselves, the people confiding in their governor entrust them to charge of taking the initiative. This was the first consequence of the initiative result of election. The council soon became the greatest obstacle to the revolution, thus provide the political axiom that the government cannot be revolutionary. And remember, the people who wanted to keep them and the people who were in power there were socialists who subscribed to hierarchy and state like the Blanquists and the early Marxists. The council became more and more isolated from the people who elected it and thus more and more irrelevant. As an irrelevant grew, so did its authoritarian tendencies, with the Jacobin majority created a committee of public safety to defend, quote unquote, by terror, the revolution. The committee was opposed by basically everybody else, and because the majority were Pujones, minority, and was unfortunately ignored in practice by the people of Paris that they defended their freedom against the French army, which was attacking them in the name of capitalist civilization and quote-unquote liberty. On May 21st, government troops entered the city, followed by 7 days of bitter street fighting. Squads of soldiers and armed members of the bourgeois roamed the streets, killing and maiming at will. Over 25,000 people were killed in the street fighting, many murdered after they had surrendered, and their bodies dumped in mass graves. As a final insult, a sacrament was built by the bourgeois in the birthplace of the Commune, the Battle of Montmartre, to atone for the radical and atheist revolt which had soon terrified them, because they basically abolished religion at this point. So it was basically the first ever anarchist and also atheist civilization. You don't understand. For anarchists, the lesson of the Paris Commune was freehold, forcefully, a decentralized confederation community is the necessary political form of a free society. And a quote by Kropotkin, this was from that social revolution must take, the independent commune. And secondly, there is no more reason for a government inside a commune than for government above the commune. This means that an anarchist community will be based off a confederation of neighborhood and workplace assemblies freely cooperate together. Thirdly, it is critically important to unify and politically economically revolution into a social revolution. They're trying to consolidate the commune first and put off the social revolution until later, whereas the only way to proceed was the consolidating of the commune by means of social revolution. Like I said, it is one of the examples that anarchists can work, but the moment you do midway or you let the authoritarians, socialists, I know people use it as an insult, but technically, by certain definitions, there are trying to keep hierarchy and state, it leads to failure. Well, people forget that Marxists, they call themselves not communist, they call themselves revolutionaries, and they claim to not support reformists or anything, which is false because Marx and Engels themselves supported the idea of bailout bugs, electoralism, and reformism and political party within the bourgeois system. With the alliances in mind, Marxist influence in political parties had consistently argued for and taken part in election campaigns. Seeking office is a means of separating socialist ideas as a means of pursuing socialist revolution. The Social Democrats Party, which were the first Marxist party, which developed under the watchful eye of Marx and Engels, saw revolution in terms of winning a majority within parliamentary elections and using this political power to abolish capitalism, which is completely false. Which they saw in revolution in terms of winning a majority with the parliament election using this political power to abolish capitalism. Once this was done, the state would wither away, quote unquote, as classes would no longer exist. These parties aim to reproduce Marx's account on forming the Paris Commune on the level of the national parliament, which in contrast in reality, even Bakunin pointed out while the communists, and I quote again by the man himself, because for some reason he criticized Marx before basically Marxism was even a thing. He mentioned they can attain their goal by the development and organization of the political power of the working classes, aided by bourgeois radicalism. Anarchists believe they can succeed only through the development and organization of the non-political or anti-political power of the working classes. The communists believe it necessary to organize the workers' forces in order to seize the political power of the state, while anarchists organize the purpose of destroying it. Bakunin saw this in terms of creating new organs of working class power in opposition to the state, organized from the bottom up by the free association or federation of workers, starting with the association, then going on to the communes, the region, the nation, and finally culminating in a great international and universal federation. In other words, a system of workers' councils. As such, a custody argued for workers, peasants, and artisans to organize into a union and join the International Working Man Association, also known as the First International, so becoming a real force which knows what to do and is therefore capable of guiding the revolution in the direction marked out by the inspiration of the people, a serious international organization of workers' association of all lands capable of replacing this departing world of state. To Marx, argument that workers should organize politically, i.e. send a representative to parliament, but couldn't realize that when a common worker is sent to legislative assemblies, the result is that workers' deputies transplant into a bourgeois environment into an atmosphere of purely bourgeois ideas, while in fact cease to be worker and become statesmen, and they will become bourgeois, for men do not make their situations, on the contrary, men are made by them. As far as history goes, the experience of the social democracy confirmed Bakunin's analysis. A few years later, after Engels' death in 1895, the German social democracy was racked by the Revisionism Debate. This debate did not spring from the minds of a few leaders isolated from the movement, but rather expressed development within the movement itself. And in fact, the revisionists wanted to adjust the party rhetoric to what the party was actually doing, so the battle against revisionists basically represent a battle between what the party said and was going and is actually practiced. As one of the most distinguished historians of this period put it, and I quote from C. Schrocker in the book German Social Democracy: the distinction between the contenders remained largely a subjective one, a difference of ideas in the evolution of reality rather than the difference in the realm of action. End quote. By the start of the First World War, the Social Democrat became so corrupt by its activity in bourgeois institutions they supported its state and ruling class and voted for war credits rather than denouncing the war as imperialist slaughter for profit. Clearly, Bakunin was proved right. Although we must stress that Bakunin rejected participating in bourgeois politics, it did not mean he rejected politics or political struggle. And after the Paris Commune, Marx, despite being an authoritarian reactionary, especially when he took over the Internationale, and many has his idea turned into dictatorship capitalism, when he wrote the Civil War in France about the Paris Commune, people were confused because he apparently became an anarcho-syndicalist in many of his statements. Which brings us to the last issue, namely whether the revolution should be decentralized or centralized. For Marx, the issue was somewhat confused by his support for the Paris Commune and his Federalist Programme, written, we must note, by a follower of Proudhon. However, in 1850, Marx stood for extreme centralization of power, arguing that the worker must not only strive for a single and indivisible German republic, but also within this republic for the most determined centralization of power in the hands of the state authority. He argued that in a nation like Germany, where there is so many relics of the Middle Ages to be abolished, it must under no circumstances be permitted that every village, every town, and every province should put a new obstacle in the path of revolutionary activity which can proceed with full force from the center. He stressed that as France in 1793, so today in Germany, is the task of the really revolutionary party to carry out the strictest centralization, basically Jacobinism of the French Revolution, Robespierre. Lenin followed this aspect of Marx's idea, arguing that Marx was a centralist, implying disrespect both in the party and once in power. Given Marx's support for the federal ideas of the Paris Commune, it can be argued that Marx is not committed to the policy of strict centralism, although Lenin, of course, was argued that Marx was a firm supporter of centralization. What's true is to quote Daniel Guarin that Marx's comment on the Commune differed noticeably from Marx's writings of before and after 1871, while Bakunin's were in fact quite consistent with the lines he adopted in his earlier writings. Indeed, as Bakunin himself noted, while Marxists saw all their ideas upset by the uprising of the Commune, they found themselves compelled to take their hats off to it, and they went even further and proclaimed that its program and purpose were their own, in face of the simplest logic and their own true sentiment. This modification of ideas by Marx in the light of the Commune was not limited just to federalism. He also praised his system of maintaining recalcitrant delegates. This was a position which Bakunin had been arguing for a number of years previously. but which Marx had never advocated. In 1868, for example, Bakunin was talking about a revolutionary communal council composed of delegates and vested with plenary but accountable and removable ante. As such, the Paris Commune was a striking confirmation of Bakunin's ideas on many levels, not Marx, who adjusts his ideas to breed them in the line with Bakunin's. While many Marxists, especially under the Leninist tradition and that came after, like Trotskyism, Maoism, Leninism, and other traditions that came after, they're trying to say state is a necessary condition, but in place of the state, anarchists argue for free federation workers' organization as a means of conducting a revolution in the framework for its defense. Most Marxists seem to confuse centralism and federalism, with Lenin stating that, I quote, if the proletariat and the poor peasant take state power into their own hands, organize themselves quite freely in communes, and unite the action of all communes in striking at capital, won't that be centralism? Won't that be the most consistent democratic centralism and moreover proletarian centralism? No, it will be federalism and the most consistent federalism as advocated by Proudhon and Bakunin and under the influence of the former suggested by the Paris Commune. Lenin argued that some, and I quote, simply cannot conceive of the possibility of revolutionary centralism, says the guy who never put in practice during the revolution, of the voluntary vision of the proletariat communes. Again, when Lenin argued that some simply cannot conceive a possibility of voluntary centralism or the voluntary future of proletariat communes for the sole purpose of destroying bourgeois rule and the bourgeois state machine. Yet, by Lenin's definitions, voluntary centralism is at best just another way of describing federalism, assuming that voluntary really means that, of course. At worst and in practice, just centralism simply places all the decision making at the center at the top, and all that is left is for the communes to obey the decision of a few party leaders and sadly become capitalists. That's what we see today in China, Cuba, Vietnam, Laos, and North Korea. Although you could argue North Korea is more of a monarchy than anything, but that's a different discussion. So as we can see about what happened in the commune and success of anarchism and the failure of Marxism, many predictions, while many Marxists, specifically from the Leninist tradition onward, would say the anarchist has absolutely no idea what to put in place in the state. Lenin's second claim was that anarchists, and again from the word of the man himself, while advocating the destruction of the state machine, has absolutely no idea of what the proletariat put in its place compared to this to the Marxists who argue for a new state machine, which is bad, consists of armed workers after the type of the Paris Commune, quote unquote. For anarchists, Lenin's assertions simply show his unfamiliarity with anarchist literature and may not be taken seriously. Anyone familiar with anarchist theory will simply laugh at such comments. Sadly, most anarchists are not familiar with that theory, so we need to explain two things. First, anarchists have very clear ideas what to replace the state with, namely a federation commune based on worker class association. Secondly, that this is based on the idea of armed worker inspired by the Paris Commune, although predicted by Bakunin. Moreover, for anarchists, Lenin's comment seems somewhat incurious, as if they contain the standard anarchist position, if there would be the organizational basis of revolutionary society, namely that the only thing that will be put in place of government will be the free organization of the workers. This coincides summary and anarchist theory cannot be better. Can be found in works of Bakunin, Kropotkin, Malatesta, Bookchin, Chomsky, as host of other anarchist thinkers, since anarchists from Bakunin onward has stressed that the Federation of Workers Association would constitute the framework of free society to assert otherwise, as Lenin did, as little more than a joke or slander. Similar idea can be easily found in the works of other anarchists, While the actual names and specific details of these Federation Worker Association may change, for example, factory committees and Soviets in the Russian Revolution, the collectives in Spain, the section assembly in the French Revolution, or a few of them, the basic ideas are the same. Bakun also points the means of a defense, a workers' militia, the people armed as per the Paris Commune. And the anarchists are aware what should replace the bourgeois state and have always been so. The real difference is simply that anarchists say what they mean, while Lenin's new quote-unquote state did not, in fact, mean working class power, but rather party power. And because of the success of the commune and the prediction that came true by Broulholm and to a lesser extent Bakunin, it must be stressed brought the contradiction of the Marxist attack on anarchism to the surface. It is deeply sad to read, said Engel attacking anarchists for holding certain position, yet praising the 1871 revolution when it implemented exactly the same ideas. For example, his deeply inaccurate diatribe, The Bakunin is at Work, Engel was keen to distort the federalist ideas of anarchism, dismiss the, and I quote, the so-called principle of anarchy, the free federation of independent groups, end quote. Compared this to the praise for the Paris Commune, he refuted the Blanquist notion of a revolution sprung by a vanguard, which will create, and I quote by Engels himself, the strictest dictatorial centralization of all power in the hands of a new revolutionary government. Instead, the Commune appealed to the province to the form of a free federation of all French communes, a national province, the national organization, which for the first time was really created by the nation itself, was precisely the oppression power of the former centralized government, which was to fall everywhere, just as it has fallen in Paris. While many Marxists, at least in the Leninist tradition, were trying to critique anarchists or anybody who isn't doesn't subscribe to the foundations of Vladimir Lenin, and his interpretation of Marxist theory on the state is the intent to overturn decades of Marxist orthodoxy. Much of the work is quote from Marx and Engels, and Lenin's attempt to list them for his case. Equally, we need to ignore the numerous strawman arguments about anarchists and Leninists conflicts of his readers. Here's a simple list, the key points as regard Lenin's argument about his worker state and how the workers will maintain the control of it. And I quote, and again, this is all from the Lenin himself. 1. Using the Paris Commune as a prototype. Lenin argued for the abolition of parliamentarism, which he did not do. Instead, he promoted that in his work Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder, by turning a representative institution from mere talking shop into working bodies. This will be done by removing the division of labor between the legislative and the executive. 2. All officials without exception to be delegates and subject to recall at any time and so directly responsible to their constituents. 3. Immediate introduction of control and superintendence by all, so that all shall become bureaucrats for a time and so that therefore no one can become a bureaucrat. Proletarian democracy will take immediate steps to cut bureaucracy down to roots, to the complete abolition of bureaucracy, which he did not do, and that's why the free so-called socialist states are actually capitalist, as the excess of bureaucracy is official becoming transformation into privileged person divorced from the masses and superior to the masses. 4. There should be no special bodies of armed men, standing apart from the people since the majority of the people itself suppress its oppressors. A special force is no longer necessary. Using the example of the Paris Commune, Lenin suggests this meant the abolition of the standing army by the armed masses. 5. The new worker state will be the organization of violence for the suppression of the exploiting class, i.e., the bourgeoisie. The toilers need a state only to overcome the resistance of the exploiters, who are an insignificant minority, that is, the landlords and the capitalists. This will see an immense expansion of democracy for the poor, democracy for the people, while simultaneously imposing a series of restrictions On the freedom of the oppressors, the exploiters, the capitalists, the resistance must be broken by force. It is clear that where there is oppression, there is also violence. There is no freedom, no democracy. This will be implemented after the current bourgeoisie state and have been smashed. This will be the dictatorship of the proletariat and the introduction of the complete democracy for the people. End quote. However, the key principal ideas what the new semi-state were contained in these 5 points. He generalized these points, considered them valid for all countries. The first point is the creation of a working bodies, the combination of legislative and executive bodies. The first body to be created by the Bolshevik Revolution was the Council of People's Commissar, or the CPC. This was a government separate from and above the Central Executive Committee, or the CEC, of the Soviet Congress, which in turn was separate from and above the National Soviet Congress. It was an executive body elected by the Soviet Congress, but the Soviets themselves would turn into the working bodies. The promise of Lenin's state of revolution did not last the night. The Bolsheviks, it must stress, clearly recognized that the Soviets had alienated their power, and to this body would the party's Central Committee arguing in November 1970 that, and I quote, from Robert B. Daniels, A Documentary History of Communism, it's impossible to refuse a purely Bolshevik government without treason to slugger the power of the Soviet, since a majority of the Second All-Russian Congress of Soviet handed power to this government. However, it could be argued that Lenin's promise was kept as the new government simply gave itself legislative power 4 days later. Sadly, this is not the case. In the Paris Commune, the delegates of the people took executive power into their own hands. Lenin reversed this, and his executive took legislative power from the hands of the people's delegates. This concentration of power into the executive committee conquered all levels of the Soviet hierarchy. And many Marxists did not actually support, they were against the idea of workers' councils throughout history because they considered anarchist petty bourgeois idea. And it was until Lenin, until 1917, that promoted the idea of workers' council. This is not the first time when Marxists appropriate anarchists and their libertarian ideas and use authoritarian elements to undermine those libertarian ideas. Like, for example, the anarchist Kiev Volviel is linked to the 1905 Petersburg Soviet as a non-party mass organization to a central committee of the Paris Commune. And it shows you that many of the ideas can be traced to Bakunin, and the idea of the superiority of workers' class has existed around the time of the Paris Commune, but only anarchist theory, and wasn't until Lenin in 1917 tried to promote at the Workers' Council, despite being rejected by basically every Marxist before that point on. And the dominant Marxist position before 1916, when Lenin introduced anarchist ideas and undermined them, you see, Marxist authoritarian elements, that the main position that Marxists said is aimed to seize power within the existing republican state and after making sustainable modification to it and use it to create socialism. This is reformism, which Marx and Engels already promoted reformist electoralism before. This is why anarchism is the only way to actually work, and Marxism is always led to failure and appropriate anarchist ideas use the authoritarian element to undermine those libertarian ideas.